She came to court to witness justice. Instead, she became the victim of its worst betrayal. Two officers cornered her inside the courthouse, and in front of strangers they tore at more than just her dignity. What happens when the place built to protect your rights becomes the very place they're taken from you? If that hits you deep, leave a comment, hit like, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that challenge what justice really looks like. Let's step inside that courtroom, where silence shattered and everything changed. It started the way quiet storms do, unnoticed by most, felt by a few. The courthouse lobby buzzed with its usual rhythm that morning. Lawyers tapping phones, security guards sipping stale coffee, the echo of hard soles on polished tile. Everyone had somewhere to be, someone to defend, someone to prosecute. It was the kind of place where faces blurred and silence meant order. But then she walked in. Asha Monroe didn't look like she belonged there, not to them at least. She wasn't in a blazer or stiff business skirt. She didn't carry a briefcase or a manila folder full of pleadings. She wore a flowing yellow dress, soft, deliberate, graceful. It swayed lightly around her ankles as she stepped through the metal detector. No jewelry, no heels, just that dress and a calm that unnerved more than one set of eyes. She didn't flinch when the scanner beeped for no reason. She simply raised her arms, allowed the wand to pass, and gave the guard a nod, polite enough to disarm, firm enough to discourage nonsense. She was used to checkpoints. She had passed through worse than this in her lifetime. Asha was 27, but she moved with the steadiness of someone older. Someone who had learned long ago how to enter spaces that weren't built for her and how to make them hold their breath. She wasn't here for drama. She wasn't here for headlines, just to observe. In courtroom 2B that morning, a woman Asha didn't even know personally was set to testify against a city officer accused of harassment. Asha had read the story weeks ago. Black nurse routine traffic stop, no dash cam footage, 2 complaints buried. She saw herself in that story. So she showed up, just to bear witness. That was her quiet mission. She did it often. She believed sometimes presence alone was power. But as she took a seat in the last row, back straight, hands folded over her lap, Asha could already feel it, that shift in the air. Not everyone appreciated her kind of presence. A man 2 rows up glanced over his shoulder twice. A bailiff's eyes paused just a beat too long on her neckline, and from across the hallway 2 uniforms turned their heads at the same time. Officer Brent Halter leaned against the far wall with one boot crossed over the other. Stocky, late 40s with the kind of face that looked like it had been carved by years of entitlement and cheap whiskey. His arms were folded, but his eyes were sharp, scanning the room not for threats, but for targets. Next to him was Officer Cole Rucker, younger, leaner, fidgeting with the strap on his radio. He didn't stare quite the same way Brent did, but his glances were curious, twitchy, like he was watching someone else's mistake already forming. Brent nudged him with his elbow. "Check her out." "Yellow dress," he muttered, loud enough to be heard, quiet enough to be deniable. Cole gave a half glance, then looked away. Brent didn't. He watched Asha like a lion watches stillness, not with hunger, but with calculation, because here was a black woman sitting alone, looking composed, unapologetic, like she wasn't waiting for permission to exist in that space. That bothered Brent. People like her were supposed to be nervous in courthouses, quiet, deferential, invisible. But Asha Monroe in her yellow dress looked like she was holding something steady, something people like him couldn't touch. And that was a problem. Asha noticed the stares. She always did. She didn't react. That too was a learned skill. She had long ago discovered the power of not flinching. Not reacting to discomfort was its own form of resistance. And so she stayed still, eyes forward, back straight, book open on her lap, Toni Morrison's beloved pages, slightly worn at the corners. She wasn't there for them. She wasn't there to be liked. She was there because sometimes being present is the only protest you need. But in the corner of her eye, she caught at Brent pushing himself off the wall, nodding to Cole. And then they started walking toward her. Not fast, not loud, just deliberate. And though no one else in the lobby noticed, Asha's breath slowed. Not in fear, but in recognition. She'd felt this kind of silence before. The kind that comes right before something breaks. Asha had barely taken her second breath in that courtroom. before the weight of being too quiet started pressing in. To someone like Brent Halter, silence wasn't grace, it was defiance, and defiance needed to be corrected. He didn't march toward her like some angry fool with a badge. No, Brent moved the way smoke curls under a doorframe. Calm. Uninvited. Dangerous. He stepped away from the wall, his boots clicking once on the tile, then again. Cole Rucker followed behind, slower, uncertain, like a shadow that hadn't decided whether it wanted to be light or stay dark. Brent stopped beside Asha, who still sat quietly in the rear row. She hadn't moved an inch since they noticed her. He cleared his throat just enough to make his presence official. "Excuse me, miss," he said, voice low but firm. "This area is reserved for witnesses and court personnel. Unless you're planning to represent someone, I'd suggest relocating." Asha looked up. Slowly. Her expression calm, distant even. She said nothing, just folded her book, gathered her bag, and stood. Cole glanced at her hands. Empty, relaxed, controlled. He seemed to hesitate just slightly. Brent, meanwhile, kept going. He nodded once at her dress and added with a smirk, "And just a tip. Bright picnic dresses don't really say courtroom respect. But maybe that's just me." Asha didn't answer. Because answering would have granted him the one thing he wanted: reaction, and she'd spent years perfecting the art of not giving men like him what they wanted. Her silence meant as dignity read to Brent as challenge. He turned to Cole. "Rescreen her." Cole blinked. "Sir, she already cleared the front." "I said rescreen," Brent interrupted, sharper now. "Won't take long, just procedure." Asha raised an eyebrow ever so slightly, then gave a soft nod. And with that, the two officers escorted her down a side hallway away from the eyes of the courtroom. The walls grew colder, narrower. Fluorescents buzzed overhead like distant wasps. A small metal door creaked open to a room marked secondary screening, staff only. Inside it smelled like old cleaning solution and worn linoleum. No female officer was called. No explanation was given. Cole stood by the door, visibly uncomfortable now, his arms folded too tightly across his chest. Brent moved into the room behind Asha, then leaned against the far wall with a practiced ease. He looked her over head to toe as if weighing inventory. Then he stepped closer, too close. Close enough that Asha could smell the bitter hint of his coffee-stained breath. He leaned in, tilted his head, and set it soft, precise like a scalpel. Let's see what kind of dignity hides under all that golden shine. For a long second, nothing moved. Even the buzzing lights seemed to hold their breath. Asha didn't flinch, didn't step back. But her fingers curled slightly around the edge of her dress. The first tell. Brent smiled, satisfied. To him, that small flicker of discomfort was victory. Cole looked away. He didn't stop it. He didn't speak. But in that pause, in that breath he held too long, something inside him shifted. And Asha, she stood there, surrounded by cold tile and hot eyes, aware now that this wasn't about security. It never was. It was about power. About reminding her that in places built to uphold the law, some men still believe they are the law. The door clicked softly behind them, too soft for how heavy it was, like the room itself didn't want to draw attention. No cameras, no windows. Just four pale walls, humming fluorescent lights, and a silence thick enough to smother breath. Asha stood still in the middle, not shrinking, not trembling, but there was something about her stillness, like she'd quietly stepped out of her body just to survive what was coming. Cole Rucker stayed by the door, stiff and uncomfortable, his arms crossed too tight, his eyes shifting from floor to wall like a man pretending not to exist. Brent Halter didn't pretend. He moved with ease like someone who owned the space, or at least believed he did. His boots echoed on the tile, a slow rhythm of quiet control, and then he unhooked his baton. Not suddenly, not threatening, just deliberate, like a man reaching for a clipboard. He stopped just in front of Asha, close enough that she could smell the stale coffee on his breath. His eyes swept over her dress with a smirk. "You know," he said, his voice low and even, "you walk in here shining like you're untouchable, but in here, there's no room for pride." He lifted the baton, gently, casually, and used it to nudge the hem of her dress just enough to lift it slightly. Not searching, not for safety, just enough to humiliate. Asha didn't flinch. Her hands stayed at her sides, her chin held still, but her breath deepened as if she were holding it underwater. Cole glanced sideways. He saw it all, But his feet didn't move, his lips didn't part. He just stood there, shoulders tight, a witness choosing silence. Brent leaned closer, baton still teasing the fabric. Let's see what kind of dignity hides under all that golden shine. It wasn't loud, but it landed like a slap wrapped in velvet. Asha's fingers brushed the edge of her dress lightly. She didn't rip it away. She didn't scream. She didn't give him the reaction he wanted. Brent smiled, satisfied. To him, silence meant defeat. Nothing to hide, huh? He muttered. Thought so. And then Asha spoke. Quiet. Measured. A single sentence delivered like a final move in a game no one realized she was playing. Thank you, she said. That's all I needed. Brent paused, then let out a scoffing laugh. You needed that lady. You people always find a way to make everything dramatic. He clipped the baton back on his belt, still smug, still convinced he had won whatever twisted contest he thought this was. But he missed the shift in her eyes, the steel settling behind them, the stillness hardening. Under her sleeve on her left wrist, a smartwatch dimmed its red glow. Recording ended. Everything he said, his tone, his words, his smug little chuckle captured. No one noticed. Not Brent, not Cole, only Asha. As she stepped toward the door, Brent waved a hand dismissively. You're free to go. Tell your little story to whoever you want. No one's gonna believe you anyway. Asha said nothing. She passed Cole without looking at him until the very last second. Then just briefly, she glanced at him. Not in anger, but disappointment. A look that said you had a choice, and you chose silence. She put her hand on the door, paused, then turned her head slightly, her voice calm, deadly, calm. You're wrong, she said. Someone already does. And then she walked out. Head high, steps measured. The only sound in the room was the faint echo of her heels, and the silence that Brent and Cole would carry long after the door closed behind her. Asha didn't rush. Her heels clicked against the courthouse floor with a rhythm so calm it almost felt rehearsed. She walked straight back toward the courtroom, not to escape, not to cry, but to finish what had just begun. Outside the doors, people were starting to gather. The case about to be heard was minor, just a small civil complaint against the city, but inside a far bigger storm was already forming. She pushed open the courtroom doors. Brent and Cole had already returned to their positions by then. Brent stood near the front with his usual posture, bored slightly, puffed up arms, folded like a man in control of everything he could see. Cole was beside him, visibly more tense than before. His eyes didn't know where to settle. Asha didn't look at either of them. She walked straight up to the front row past the guards and stopped near the bailiff's podium. A few murmurs rippled through the room. Confused glances tossed like breadcrumbs. Then calmly she spoke. Your Honor, before this hearing begins, may I speak briefly on record? The judge, an older man with tired eyes, glanced up from his file. He looked at Asha, then at the officers. There was a pause, a flicker of hesitation, but something in Asha's voice, something in her stillness, made him nod. You have 2 minutes, he said. Go on. She nodded once. No drama, no tears. She raised her wrist and tapped gently on the screen of her smartwatch. A soft beep echoed, and then his voice filled the courtroom. You walk in here shining like you're untouchable, but in here there's no room for pride. Let's see what kind of dignity hides under all that golden shine. Nothing to hide, huh? Thought so. You needed that, sweetheart. You people always find a way to make everything dramatic. The room froze, not a breath, not a shuffle. The words were too clear, too recent, too real. Brent's jaw tightened. His arms dropped from their crossed stance, but he didn't move otherwise. Not yet. Cole, on the other hand, lowered his head. His face turned pale and his hand went instinctively to his chest, like he was trying to cover something that wasn't bleeding yet, but soon would. The judge's mouth opened slightly, and for a long moment he didn't say a word. The gallery, which had only minutes ago been scrolling phones and checking watches, now leaned forward, silent, stunned. Asha didn't look at anyone. She simply let the audio play, all the way through. No interruptions, no glances for approval, no dramatic pauses. And when it ended, she pressed the screen again, stopping the playback. Then she raised her eyes slowly and looked directly at the judge. Her voice was soft, steady, controlled. That happened just 7 minutes ago, in your building. No female officer present. No search protocol followed. Just power and humiliation. A silence followed that wasn't just uncomfortable, it was cracking. Brent forced a smirk. It was thin, brittle, like cheap glass under pressure. That recording was taken without consent. He started voice trying to find its usual weight. Unlawful. Unverified. Out of context, but his words weren't landing. Not this time. Because even before the judge could respond, someone in the gallery whispered, "That's his voice. I'd recognize it anywhere." Then another person muttered, "I heard it too." And just like that, the silence started to shift. It wasn't just quiet now, it was turning. The courtroom hadn't exploded. There were no gasps or shouts, but the energy had changed. Brent felt it too. He adjusted his collar, cleared his throat. Suddenly the uniform didn't sit quite right on him anymore. And Cole still hadn't looked up. Asha turned back toward the judge. "I came here today to observe a hearing," she said, voice still measured. "But now I'm requesting this incident be entered into the court record, under oath." The judge nodded slowly, carefully, as if the air around him had thickened. "Yes," he said finally. "It will be." And with that, Asha returned to her seat, quiet as ever. But now the room had changed. She was no longer a background figure. She was the pivot around which the story now turned. And for the first time, Brent didn't know how to regain control. Asha sat in the gallery, still, calm on the outside. But inside, her pulse was steady like a war drum. She didn't reach for her phone right away. She waited until the tension in the room had settled into that awkward buzz when Brent had slunk to the back corner and Cole had disappeared from the front bench altogether. Then, with no ceremony, she pulled out her phone and stepped quietly into the hallway. It wasn't a call to a lawyer. It wasn't to a friend or sibling. It was a number she hadn't dialed in nearly a year. She pressed it without hesitation, waited for just 2 rings. Then a familiar voice picked up, deep, measured, touched with exhaustion, but still unmistakably alert. Victor Monroe. She didn't waste time. "They tried it again, sir, in your courthouse." "And this time, I have proof." There was a pause. Just 3 seconds. But in that silence, you could hear the breath of a man shifting from peace to readiness, from retired protector to returning general. Victor Monroe had once stood on riot lines, marched in courtrooms, and shielded the voiceless. Now he sat behind a desk with a city seal, but some instincts never dull. "Where are you?" he asked. "Courtroom 2A. The audio's been played publicly. They're trying to cover it up already." Victor didn't shout, didn't curse, didn't ask for more details. He just exhaled once, slow, controlled, and said, "Stay where you are. I'm initiating emergency review procedures. You're not alone." The line went dead. Within 5 minutes, the quiet gears of the city began to shift. At the mayor's command, the courthouse's internal security system was locked. A preservation order was issued. No camera feed, no audio log, no hallway record could be deleted or touched. The chief of internal affairs received a call at his home office barefoot halfway through a sandwich. Within 10 minutes, he was on the road. A direct message pinged across the devices of the city's Civil Rights Commission assemble at the courthouse. 30 minutes. Bring full authority. It wasn't panic, it was something far more focused. It was an old soldier reaching for armor he thought he'd never wear again, because someone somewhere had forgotten what happens when power meets memory. Meanwhile, back in the courthouse hallway, Asha stood at the window. She could see the courthouse plaza below, calm, busy with people who had no idea what had just cracked open inside these walls. Her reflection in the glass stared back at her. Same yellow dress, same quiet eyes. But this time, she wasn't just surviving. She was summoning something. Not revenge, not rage, just justice, called by its first name. And this time it was answering. It started with a girl in the back row, barely 20, a local college student majoring in journalism shadowing the court for a class project. She hadn't come for drama, just a credit. But when Asha played the recording, when the words poured out like poison in the open air, she instinctively tapped her screen, and quietly she went live. The camera didn't shake. Her hand was steady, maybe from shock, maybe from something deeper. The live stream didn't start with a bang. No title, no hashtags, just raw footage. But within minutes, comments began to appear. What is this? Who said that? Wait, is this real? By the time Asha returned to her seat, thousands were already watching. By the time she looked up again, it was trending. Inside the courtroom, a man in a gray suit stood slowly. Middle-aged, white, a defense attorney well known in the city for being by the book. He adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and asked the judge for permission to speak. "I was present for everything. I can verify the voice, the timing, and the tone. And if needed, I'll testify under oath. A hush swept the room. Not because he was loud, but because he wasn't the kind of man who ever raised his hand. And yet here he was choosing sides without hesitation. Brent clenched his jaw so tight it trembled, but he didn't speak. Not yet. Down the hall, another domino fell. A young woman in court staff uniform stood behind a column hand covering her mouth. Her name was Jamie Tran, a case clerk, not important, not powerful, and for years invisible. But now she was staring at her phone, watching the live stream, and hearing that voice again, Brent's voice. Her memory flooded back like cold water 2 years ago. Storage room. The way his hand lingered too long, the breath at her neck. The whisper, "No one will believe you." She hadn't spoken. She'd buried it. But now someone else had brought his voice into the light. Jamie didn't breathe for 10 seconds. Then she stepped out from behind the column and walked. Not to the bathroom, not to hide. She walked into that courtroom, right up to the judge. "I need to speak," she said, her voice soft but firm. "That man, Officer Brent Halter, he's done this before. To me. I was too scared to come forward, but not anymore." The silence this time felt sacred, as if the room itself was holding its breath for her. And somewhere between all that, between bravery and consequence, Cole Rucker sat alone in a side room. His hands were shaking. He was watching the same live stream, watching Asha, watching Jamie, watching Brent's face crumble inch by inch. And something inside Cole cracked, not loudly, not all at once, but deeply. He had stood still for too long, but now he was done standing. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his department keycard, logged into the internal system, found the camera logs. Yes, the one Brent thought didn't exist. The one that recorded the hallway outside the security room. There wasn't audio, but there was enough. Enough to prove that no female officer entered. Enough to show Brent followed Asha inside alone. Enough to confirm the timeline. He compressed the file, opened a burner email. No name, no signature. He typed in one address, the lawyer in the gray suit, then hit send. A single file. No subject line. But the kind of proof that makes silence impossible. Then he leaned back in the chair and closed his eyes. He wasn't a hero, he was late. But at least he'd finally moved. Back in the courtroom, the judge looked pale. The public was watching. The truth was now too loud to whisper away. And Asha, she didn't smile, didn't gloat. She just sat quietly, knowing justice wasn't done, but for the first time, it had begun. There were no sirens, no flashing lights, not even the sound of hurried boots. Victor Monroe entered the courthouse the way a storm moves in quietly, but with a presence you feel before you see it. No press followed him. No cameras swiveled in his direction. And yet the air shifted the moment he crossed the threshold. There was no need for announcements. People just noticed. Their voices softened, their glances sharpened, as if instinctively sensing something important was unfolding. He wasn't wearing a ceremonial badge or an official sash, just a simple dark suit, clean, but worn like a man who knew he'd be walking into something difficult and didn't want attention for it. He moved with purpose, not haste. Not a single motion wasted. Victor didn't speak until he reached the center aisle of the courtroom where the silence was thick and waiting. His eyes found Brent Halter and Cole Rucker with surgical precision. Not a glare, not a scowl, just the sort of look that asked nothing and said everything. When he finally spoke, his voice didn't rise above a courtroom whisper, but somehow it filled the entire space. "Effective immediately," he said, "Officer Brent Halter and Officer Cole Rucker are hereby suspended from duty. Deputy Chief Fields will execute a temporary detainment order under City Code 12.4, pending full investigation." The words landed without drama, clean, cold, and final. Deputy Chief Harland Fields, who had been waiting quietly along the side wall, stepped forward with steady hands. He didn't ask for clarification. He didn't hesitate. He just nodded once and moved. Brent flinched like someone waking from a bad dream. His voice cracked through the tension. "You can't do this," he barked louder than necessary. "You're not the judge." Victor turned to him slowly. No emotion cracked the surface of his face. He didn't step forward. He didn't raise his voice. "No," he said calmly. "I'm not the judge." He took a breath, steady as a heartbeat. "I'm the reckoning." The words weren't loud, but they didn't need to be. They carried weight not because of their volume, but because everyone in that room understood exactly what they meant. Brent tried to speak again, but the fight had already left him. Whatever power he thought he had, it was gone. It had slipped out from under him the moment no one rose to defend him. Cole didn't speak at all. He simply nodded almost to himself and raised his hands without being asked. He looked down at the floor like a man who had finally accepted the line he'd crossed couldn't be uncrossed. As both men were escorted out of the courtroom, Victor turned to the judge, his tone still even, still measured. All security footage and access logs from today are being preserved by executive order. A civilian oversight panel has been activated. Internal Affairs will begin a parallel investigation within the hour, and the full report will come across my desk before it goes anywhere else. No one argued. No one dared. Then and only then Victor's eyes found Asha. He didn't nod. He didn't smile. But the look he gave her, quiet, unwavering, said everything she needed to hear. I saw you. I heard you. This won't be buried. Without another word, he turned and walked away. The doors closed gently behind him. But the silence that followed wasn't hollow. It was charged, because something had shifted, not just for Asha, for everyone watching. The courtroom didn't feel like the same place anymore. It wasn't just that Brent and Cole were now seated at the defendant's table, their uniforms traded for gray county-issued suits, or that the usual chatter before the hearing was gone, replaced by a silence so thick it made the ceiling fans sound louder than they should. It was something deeper, like the room itself knew that for once it wasn't being used to silence the truth, but to hear it. At the front stood Prosecutor Dana Ellison, a sharp-eyed black woman with clipped hair and a posture that didn't bend. She had never spoken publicly about the harassment she'd endured during her first years in the DA's office, but today she didn't need to reference the past. Her presence alone was a message. This isn't just about what happened last week. It's about everything that came before and was buried. Brent shifted in his seat, eyes scanning the jury box with a restlessness that gave him away. Cole, on the other hand, looked straight ahead, motionless, haunted maybe, or just resigned. Then the clerk called Asha Monroe to the stand. She walked slowly, not dramatically, not to draw attention, but in the kind of quiet that draws attention anyway. Grace under tension, deliberate with every step, sworn in, seated, and then silence. The room braced for emotion. But when Asha opened her mouth, there was none. No shaking, no righteous fury, just truth, calm, precise, sharper than any scream. They took me into a side room under the pretense of a second screening, she said. There was no female officer present. Officer Halter lifted my dress with a baton and made remarks about my body. Officer Rucker stood at the door. He didn't say anything. He didn't stop it either. She didn't look at the jury. She didn't need to. Her words weren't crafted for sympathy. They were tools, scalpels, cutting straight through every excuse the defense might have prepared. I said thank you. That's all I needed. Because I had recorded everything. At that, Prosecutor Ellison nodded once. She didn't even need to introduce the exhibit. The recording was already logged into evidence. All she had to do was hit play. Brent's voice crackled to life in the speakers, unmistakable. Let's see if she's hiding anything under that golden pride. You could hear the scrape of metal, the rustle of fabric, the silence that followed. Then Asha's voice again, calm, icy. Thank you, that's all I needed. Someone in the gallery let out a breath they didn't know they'd been holding. Next came the security footage. Grainy, but clear. It showed Asha being led away. Brent opening the door. No female officers in sight. Cole watching. Not stopping. And finally, the curveball. A copy of the anonymous email sent to Asha's legal counsel, complete with timestamp, internal file path, and source IP address. Cole had confessed. Quietly. In a written statement filed just that morning. He hadn't testified in person. He didn't want leniency. He just wanted out. The defense offered little. Brent's lawyer fumbled through vague suggestions about standard procedure, but even that fell flat. There was nothing to justify and too much to explain away. By the time the jury was dismissed to deliberate, everyone already knew what the verdict would be. Still they waited. They always wait. But for once, silence in the courtroom wasn't about fear or submission. It was the sound of reckoning, finally fully taking its seat. The gavel came down without hesitation, and with it, the courtroom exhaled finally. Brent Halter was sentenced to 9 years in state prison with no chance of parole for at least 6. Cole Rucker received a suspended sentence, 2 years probation, 5 years barred from holding any public service position, and mandatory psychological review. He didn't protest. He didn't even flinch. He just nodded once like a man who knew this wasn't the end of the road, just the debt coming due. But the story didn't stop with the verdict, because the real sentence that day wasn't written on paper. It echoed in conversations outside the courthouse, in hallways where whispers once lived, in inboxes where old complaints suddenly reappeared. Within a week, the city announced the re-examination of 32 internal complaints against courthouse law enforcement, most of them previously dismissed as unsubstantiated. Suddenly, unsubstantiated wasn't good enough anymore. One woman came forward, then another. A young interpreter who once left her job without explanation. A janitor who'd requested a transfer and was denied. Even a retired bailiff who confessed he'd turned a blind eye years ago because he thought it was just the way things worked. But now things were working differently. Mayor Victor Monroe signed an executive order just 3 days after the verdict. The document was short, blunt, precise. It dissolved the courthouse's internal security division as it stood and replaced it with a new oversight structure, mixed civilian law enforcement panels, anonymous reporting systems, and mandatory quarterly audits publicly available. No more blind corners, no more hidden rooms, and no more pretending silence was neutral. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, but this time they weren't looking for scandal. They were capturing something else, something quieter but more lasting. Voices. A former court clerk was asked what had changed. She didn't hesitate. We saw her stand up, and suddenly, none of us wanted to sit down anymore. The ripple kept spreading. Local universities hosted panels on whistleblower protections. Churches opened late-night circles for survivors of institutional abuse. An entire community seemed to lean in all at once, as if they'd just realized how much they'd held in, and how tired they were of holding it. And through it all, Asha said very little. She didn't give interviews. She didn't sign book deals. She simply returned to her quiet apartment, kept walking her dog each morning, and kept showing up like always when someone else needed to be seen. The justice she triggered wasn't loud. It didn't come with banners or applause. But it came, and it stayed. Because sometimes it only takes one person to say enough, and the whole system remembers what it was supposed to be. The courthouse looked smaller this time. Maybe it was the afternoon light casting long shadows across the marble floors, or maybe it was because Asha Monroe was no longer walking in as a target. She was walking in as someone who had survived. She didn't wear yellow today, just a simple gray sweater, dark jeans, and a soft scarf folded at her neck. She wasn't here to testify. She wasn't here to protest. She came to sit, there in the lobby, on the same bench where weeks ago she'd been questioned, cornered, watched like she didn't belong. She sat with her hands folded, not fidgeting, not scrolling her phone, just being. People passed by, clerks, security attorneys late for docket. A few glanced at her, then looked again. Some smiled, others nodded. No one spoke. But that wasn't silence. That was acknowledgement. And then came the girl. She couldn't have been more than 8 or 9. Brown skin, tight braids, a tiny backpack slung on one shoulder. She hesitated just a second, as if unsure whether it was okay. Then she stepped forward. No introduction, no words, just a small piece of paper held out in both hands. Asha blinked, gently took it. It was a drawing, crayon lines. Simple, bright, a little shaky, but full of something bigger than talent. It showed a woman standing tall in a courtroom, sunlight pouring through a high window. Around her, people watched. Some pointed. Some stood up. And above her head, in neat block letters, "You made court safe again." Asha didn't cry. That wasn't her way. She folded the paper once, then again, as if wrapping something precious. She looked at the little girl who was still standing there, unsure whether to smile or run. Instead, Asha leaned forward. Her voice was low, steady, just enough for the girl to hear. "Thank you. You drew the truth." The girl beamed, just for a second, then skipped off before anyone could make it a moment. Asha sat back. She looked around the room again, this time slower, letting the stillness settle over her like breath after a long run. She knew the damage wasn't undone, that courts would still be hard places, that justice was still a fight. But today, here on this bench, she wasn't hiding. She wasn't surviving. She was present. And as the light shifted once more across the floor, she whispered to no one in particular. Maybe to the room, maybe to herself. Let justice echo louder than silence. Then she stood, tucked the folded drawing into her coat pocket, and walked calmly toward the exit. No applause. No press. But for the first time in a long time, maybe ever, she walked away from a courthouse with nothing to prove and everything still to protect. Some stories don't need a hero in a cape, just a woman brave enough to stand up when silence becomes unbearable. Asha's journey wasn't about revenge. It was about truth, about dignity, and about reminding all of us that justice should never come with a price tag or a dress code. If this story moved you, if it made you think or feel or remember something worth standing up for, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Mr. Mac's Stories for more powerful, true-to-life tales that echo far beyond the final scene. Your support means more than you know. Every click, every comment, every share, it's what keeps stories like this alive and what helps our team keep digging deeper to bring you voices that matter. Because at Mr. Mac's Stories, we believe in one simple truth. Silence protects no one. But storytelling, it can change everything. We'll see you in the next one.